Get a little bit started here, but before we turn it over to the first presenter, I just want to just cover a few things that just to build some context for this session. And if you could go to the next slide. We're really here to develop the future together, and we're very fortunate that our elected leaders have allowed and input into the 5-party and 3-party IGA. The Stafford Hamlet has a voice in the future. Not only in Stafford Hamlet, but the surrounding community. So we think this is an important first step. We hope this will be a series of opportunities to learn and listen about moving forward. And if you've had a chance to look at the community vision plan, the overwhelmingly approved plan had a preservation portion within that. It's really about preserving the character within the hamlet, and specifically open space, eco-friendly businesses like farms, equestrian and vineyards and orchards, increase interconnectivity between the units. So we think this is a nice way to start this process off, to learn more about how this could be into the future. So right now I'd like to introduce Hannah Clark, Pacific Northwest lead for the American Farmland Trust. Before Hannah joined the Farmland Trust, she was the executive director for the Washington Association of Land Trusts. And she brings a lot of diverse experience, not in the Pacific Northwest, but within the conservation community. And she'll tell you more about American Farmland Trust and their role, but basically they're interested in protecting, preserving farmland and coming up with tools and techniques that allow individuals and farmers to make that happen. So Hannah, if you come on up.
So American Farmland Trust has been around for almost 40 years, and we were really founded as the first group doing agricultural land protection and pioneering agricultural conservation easements. And our mission is threefold. We work to save the land that sustains us by protecting farm and ranch land, promoting sound farming practices, and keeping farmers on the land. And we started by just doing farmland protection, pioneering conservation easements, but over time we realized that it's not enough just to protect the acres. We really need to protect land by the inch as well, so protect the soil that feeds us all, and it's not farmland without farmers. So we need to really support farmers and ensure that we have farmers on that land moving forward. So I just want to take a moment. If I could ask all the farmers who are in the audience to either stand up or raise your hand. Awesome. Can we give them a round of applause? These are the people who are feeding us every day, and we really need to remember how important they are to all of us. We would not eat without them, so thank you. So AFT works from the kitchen table to Congress. We're a big advocate on the Farm Bill, and we provide tools and resources to support local governments, land trusts, agencies, and above all, farmers, with research, templates, and capacity building to protect farmland. And we advance policy solutions at the local, state, and federal level to make sure that we have farmland into the future. And we also work on the ground. So we accomplish on-the-ground projects for farmland protection and also sound and environmentally sound farming practices that can be scaled up and achieve bigger impacts. So if you haven't heard of us, you might have heard of our bumper sticker, no farms, no food. And you can see these all over the place. I love seeing them. So we have a stack in the front of the room, but it's really true. If we don't have farms, we don't have food. So if I do my job well today, you're going to leave with a few main points, and I just want to run over them at the beginning. First, that farms and farmland are critical infrastructure, that farmland, really prime key farmland, is a finite resource, and that there's no farmland without farmers, and access is the biggest hurdle for the next generation. And finally, that farm viability, which is so critical, is often linked to and dependent on farmland protection, farmland access, and farming practices. So next slide. I mentioned that AFT does a lot of research and works to provide resources for folks like all of you who are interested in protecting farmland to know, what are we really dealing with here? And so Farms Under Threat is our biggest initiative to date. It's the most comprehensive mapping initiative ever undertaken to get a good handle on where are we now? What have we lost in terms of farmland in this country? Where's the best land for farming and growing food? And so we're looking both back into the past to gauge farmland conversion over the last 20 years, inventorying what we have now, and then looking to future threats from development pressure, climate change, and demographic changes across the country. So our National Farms Under Threat report came out last May. You can find that on our website, and I can share that. And that really showed at the national level what we found. We're right now working on state-by-state mapping, and so in November of this year, we will have for Oregon an interactive online platform where you can actually go in and zoom in on your community and see all of these maps and analysis in terms of farmland threat conversion and what we call our productivity, versatility, and resilience mapping score. So where's the best land for growing food? So what we started with is looking at land cover and use across the US and really taking a bunch of different data sets and putting them together and seeing what is the extent and distribution of ag land in America. So we have about 912 acres of non-federal land that's used for agriculture in the country. So that's shown in yellow and green up here on this map. And then next slide. So from that, we can pull out the total land used for agriculture in the US, which includes ag land, federal land used to graze livestock as well. And so this map here, you might look at it and think, okay, what's the problem? That's a whole lot of land. We have a lot of land in this country that's used for farming. Next slide. But then we layer on an analysis of the best land for agriculture. So this is showing the most productive, the most versatile, and the most resilient land for growing food. And this is really critical in the face of climate change especially. So looking at where are we resilient into the future. And this analysis depends largely on the quality of soil, farming infrastructure that currently exists, the climatic conditions and growing season, and a number of other factors that we worked with soil scientists and agronomists across the country to develop. Next slide. So what we found is that only about a third of our land that's currently in agricultural production is really great for food and crop production. So only about a third. Next slide. And then we layer on threat. So back to the loss of farmland. So we looked at conversion of farm and ranch land to both urban and low-density residential development between 1992 and 2012. And so on this map, the areas in red are the areas with high conversion. And the best land for agriculture that was on the last slide is in green. So across the country, we see areas all around the nation where those dark green areas, the land that's best for growing food, directly overlaps with the land that we're losing the quickest. And so if you think about this, it makes a lot of sense, right? We as humans need food to survive, and we've established communities in fertile places where we can grow food. And so as urban areas expand, we're actually expanding really quickly into our best soils and best land for growing food. Next slide. So here's what we found. We're losing 3 acres of farmland every minute in the US. We found that we have lost 31 million acres over the last 2 decades or so, which is double the amount of farmland loss that anyone had previously estimated. And so we thought it was bad, and it's worse than we thought. And so 3 acres a minute, it's really important to keep that in mind as we think about keeping the land that we have now in production. Next slide. So I mentioned earlier this kind of pattern of development. So 62% of all of the development in the US, according to our analysis, was on agricultural land. So we're overdeveloping our farmlands. And over a third of those acres were among the best farmland in the nation, the most productive, versatile, and resilient land. And I probably don't have to remind you all that it's taken millennia for those lands to develop those characteristics and for those soils to develop. And so this is a really big deal. Those aren't lands that we can get back. And like I said, expanding urban areas accounted for over half of that loss, and the rest was due to low-density rural residential development. Next slide. So what are the main takeaways here from our national farms under threat analysis? Basically, the land that we have for growing food is a very limited resource, and it's very precious. And much of the nation's most productive land for growing food is on the outskirts of cities, where we've been developing the fastest. Reminds me of where we are today, right? So we need to protect that land. It's where we grow the food that feeds us all. So just want to drill one thing more home here. By 2040, we're estimated to have 66 million more people in the US that we need to feed. And with climate change, with sea level rise, with changes in growing seasons, we really need to be very mindful in planning for the future and making sure that we have the land that's needed to sustain us all and the farmland that's close into our communities, and really value that. Next slide. And we have this amazing resource in the US. We have 10% of the Earth's arable land. So we have more than our fair share of really excellent land for growing food in the US, and we have control over what happens there. And so, we really need to feed the world. Next slide. So I really want to impress upon you that we want people to start thinking about farmland as basic infrastructure. So most of us think of infrastructure as roads and bridges and broadband and these different things, and we talk about investing in them. But there's a deeper and more basic infrastructure, this farmland that literally sustains us all. And the definition of infrastructure is fundamental facilities and systems for serving society. And what fits better with that than farmland? So as with roads and bridges, we need to invest in keeping this infrastructure for growing food so that our kids and grandkids and our economy can flourish into the future. And as we know, our farmland is disappearing at an alarming rate, 3 acres a minute and 1.5 million acres a year. So we need to invest more. Next slide. And I thought this was really interesting. Nationally, for every penny that states invest in farmland, we're investing $10 in highways. And so how does that show that we are really valuing this farmland infrastructure as a society based on our investments? So what can we do? I wanted to highlight that Oregon has an amazing initiative that's going on right now to do just this, to invest in agricultural conservation easements that would protect farmland, both in perpetuity and some funding for shorter-term easements, but really permanently protect the farms that sustain us. And it's called the Oregon Agricultural Heritage Program, OAHP, and a lot of you are probably really familiar with this, but there's a request in the legislature right now for $10 million for OAHP. This would be the first ag easement program funded in Oregon and would give a fantastic resource to do everything that we're talking about right now. When we look at states like New York, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, way over there on the East Coast, I hate to compare us, but they're investing about $20 to $40 million every year in farmland protection. And so over here on the West Coast, we're kind of behind the curve, and we need to think about how do we make sure that we're investing. We have the resources, so in 20 years, how do we make sure that we're going to have those same resources in the future? A couple words about easements. We have seen time after time that when farmers are paid for the development value of their land, about 84% of farmers are going to put that money back into their operations, so either growing their business, paying off loans, or helping to transfer that land to the next generation. And over 75% are, or farmers are 75% more likely to adopt a conservation practice if they have a permanent easement, because you know that that land's going to be in farming into the future, and that's an investment that they can make. I just also want to note that Oregon is facing a massive intergenerational transfer right on the horizon. 2/3 of Oregon's farmland is set to change hands just in the next 2 decades. And so our ability to produce food and support our economies is really going to depend on how can we get that next generation onto this land. And a vast majority of those farmers who are 65 and older, that 2/3 of farmland, don't have an identified heir succession plan. And so a national survey by the National Young Farmers Coalition found that the number one challenge for young farmers is accessing land and actually being able to afford farmland. And that is the main reason cited for farmers actually quitting farming or not taking it up in the first place, especially if these are young farmers who have been renting or in some sort of incubator program. They cannot afford to buy farmland on a farm income. And so this is really, if we think about that, 2/3 of Oregon's farmland changing hands, every one of those acres is a risk of being taken out of agricultural production. So farm real estate is more expensive than ever, and the average price of farmland has over doubled since 2004. And so this is a really key ingredient to this puzzle as we're thinking about protecting farmland. And back to agricultural conservation easements, when you think about that tool, buying development rights actually takes some of the value away from that farmland and gives that money at the point to the farmers. And so it makes that land more accessible to young farmers and really helps with this transfer of land. Go to the next slide. So I just wanted to talk a little bit about a tool that AFT has developed back in the 80s, actually. So, one of the arguments when we're talking about farmland preservation is how does development stack up against agricultural land in terms of tax base and support for communities? And so AFT, to help communities make some of these decisions, developed these cost of community services studies. And so really what we're looking at is measuring the contribution of agricultural lands to our local tax base. And we've done these, or we and partners have done these in about 151 communities across the nation. Next slide. So to conduct these cost of community services studies, we first collect data on local revenues and expenditures, group the revenues and expenditures and allocate them to the community's major land use categories, and then analyze the data and calculate the revenue to expenditure ratio for each category. So these are a snapshot in time of the costs versus revenues for each land use. It's not a projection into the future, but it gives a pretty good sense of where the community's revenues are coming from and helps inform land use and policy decisions. So next slide. So across the country, I said there have been about 151 of these studies done. What we've seen is that communities pay a really high price for unplanned growth. And that if you look at this chart, we found that residential development, for every dollar invested, or the cost to provide public services for every dollar of revenue raised is about $1.16 for residential development and only 37 cents for agriculture. So pretty stark and consistent results across the country. And we know why, right? Development causes traffic congestion, air and water pollution, loss of open space, loss of land to grow food, and there's a lot of investment in infrastructure needed. So it's just really important to take this into account as we're looking at development. Next slide. And really what we've been trying to do with these cost of community services studies is address 3 big misperceptions about farmland and development across the nation, and you hear these everywhere. The first is that open lands are an interim land use that should be developed to highest and best use, and that includes productive farms and forests. The second is that when we tax agricultural land at open space rates, it gets an unfair tax break when it's assessed instead of at its potential use value for residential or commercial development. And the third is that residential development will lower our property taxes by increasing the tax base. So from those results that you saw on the last screen, we can see, that's not necessarily true because agricultural land is actually contributing more to the local economy while taking less in infrastructure, and really is an important, as we talked about before, infrastructure for the community. Next slide. So I mentioned earlier that I think all of this we need to be thinking about in the context of climate change. It's real, it's here, and farmers are in the front lines, both with the effects of climate change, but our ability to mitigate and be more resilient in the future. And climate change is impacting all dimensions of our food security and our food systems: availability, our access, and food safety. And what AFT is focusing on the next slide, 3 strategies. So reducing conversion of agricultural land so that we have the land base, but so that we can also increase the adoption of climate-smart agriculture. We know that soil health is directly linked to carbon sequestration, and things that farmers can do are actually some of the most immediate and lowest cost solutions that we have in front of us for sequestering carbon and actually mitigating the impacts of climate change. We don't need any new technology. They're things that farmers are doing today. We just really need to invest and help those happen. The nice thing, too, is that all of the practices that we're looking at that can actually sequester carbon are also great for resiliency. Things like cover cropping and reduced tillage both help with carbon sequestration, but help farmers with productivity, with water retention, with soil health. And then finally, we need to support policies like smart solar siting and things that help us, as we're moving into the future with new policies, not have unintended consequences that hurt farmers. So I hope, thank you, John, that you'll view AFT as a resource. No farms, no food. We have the second website down here. I hope that you'll all write it down, or we can make it available. Our Farmland Information Center is actually funded by USDA, and we have a whole website that has templates and white papers and documents and all sorts of examples from across the country that can help local planners, local elected officials make decisions. And we actually have a 1-800 number that you can call anytime, any day, and someone will help you find whatever it is you need. And then finally, next slide, let's keep our farmland in production. Next slide. So this is my contact information. I hope that you will all count me as a resource, and I really look forward to working with all of you to keep this beautiful community in farming. Thank you.